Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome, everyone. So this morning, we were sitting at coffee with some people, and going around the table, one person was speaking about the difficulty of resolving conflict with a estranged son. One person's partner had just received another cancer diagnosis. 3 people's jobs were in a state of flux. And it's interesting to hear the scope and prevalence of dukkha in people's lives. We can forget, or we can think we're alone in our own disappointments and struggles, but there's something meaningful and comforting about knowing we aren't alone in this. And there's also a power to the recollection that when things seem especially fraught, when a political situation seems especially disrupted, when family is falling apart, when you have that vision for one moment, one day, sometimes one year, that this conditioned realm, samsara, isn't just a little broken, it's truly, really broken. And this isn't a hopeless statement, despite how it sounds. But this wake-up call. There's a sutta where the Buddha says that the devas, the angels, when a Tathagata, a Buddha, comes to visit them, they begin to quake and tremble and hide, and they say, "Oh no, we thought we were permanent, but alas, we are impermanent." And we are all impermanent, and we forget how easily we forget and begin to accessorize with practice and pick from this and that in our little buffet of American spirituality. And what's so bad about the Netflix subscription and all this? People can have Netflix subscriptions, it's okay. But we forget. And to know one way one purifies gold is introduce an element which grabs the heavier elements out of the gold and sinks them to the bottom such that the gold can rise bright and luminous on its own. And this is how I think about the times when things break again. It's us remembering that what we'd implicitly, unconsciously, again, wound our hearts to, or bound our hearts to, is not worthy of our hearts. And this is the gift of dukkha, of suffering. It's this friction that allows us to remember that we have been placed here, we have come here, because there is a higher order goal we've found, that we've intuited. And this doesn't necessarily have to be immediately some article of faith completely, but rather a recollection of that first moment when you truly touched this path, when you intuited what it meant to have a path. The Buddha says that dukkha can lead to 2 reactions: bewilderment or a search, faith. And what happens when Plato's prisoner, disenchanted with the shadows after years, instead of just casting his eyes down towards his own clutched hands, looks around and sees the glow from outside again and intuits sunlight. And we all remember that first, I think, time when we touched this truth. And it was not a moment of learning something new, of something we hadn't known. It's a moment of recognition, of coming home. Of course, this. Longpo Sumedho talks about he was in the Navy and was reading the book What the Buddha Taught. And he made it through one page and said, "Oh, I'm a Buddhist." And for me, I was 15 and read Siddhartha, and my first vision of the Buddha, and this sense of golden light, of stepping into a footstep made for you, these moments of grace, which we forget in the cacophony and static of day-to-day life. But remember, those moments, those are your landmarks to steer by. And many of you know that book, or some of you might know, by Rebecca Solnit, called A Paradise Built in Hell, where she outlines the goodness in the human heart, that leaps up in the moments that seem most broken. The carpet bombings of London, the siege at Sarajevo, how people come together in those moments and find and remember something profound and deep in their own being and purpose, because the conditioned realm has reminded them, as it always does, that it is not what we can set our eyes on. There's a quote from A Course in Miracles called, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. This is the peace of God." And so in these moments when we feel the brokenness of reality, Longpo Suchito says, we expect too much from human life. Human life is not that good. You get married, it's all right. Your kids go wild. And it's helpful to widen the scope from this moment. Look back to history, to the Buddha's time. You had kingdoms clashing. You had the Buddhist chief disciples, kings, being murdered by their sons. And you had schism in the Sangha, and the Buddha navigated all of this with utmost compassion. And this is the thing, this is not a hopeless path, it's hopeful. Because if you can take these moments when you sense the brokenness and imperfection of the conditioned realm, not that you don't try to fix it where you can, not that you can't take action, of course you can, but that it's an opportunity to watch those heavier elements fall to the bottom again and see and remember the gold that is our refuge. The luminous, malleable, workable, bright mind. And the Buddha spoke of awakening. This is not a practice he recommended doing just to lower your blood pressure, to be slightly better at work. He taught a path to the complete cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion in the heart. And the fact that that's a possibility for the human heart should, if remembered, recollected, repeated to oneself, utterly shift and shake our trajectory in life. And there's something when it's aligned to that true Polaris, which is strong and knows its truth. Every other route in the world is too shallow for the fullness of our heart, and we know this implicitly. There's something deep down which knows the well-adjusted middle-class life is a cheap goal for a life. We want something more. We owe the world something more. And you can live that mundane, normal life, but by using it as a path of practice towards the highest of all goals, awakening, purity of heart, one ennobles a life. It can look very similar on the surface, but something fundamental has shifted. So the Buddha spoke about awakening, and the word he used, nibbana, means cessation, extinction, going out, which are perhaps the three least inspiring words we could use for enlightenment. But it's helpful to remember the context. First, the Buddha was talking in the context of the Ganges River Valley in India, which is really hot. So a Northern European culture intuits the going out of a flame as death and cold and blankness. Whereas if you're in the middle of the summer in India, if a fire goes out, it's not all that bad, actually. Additionally, there was a paradigm of Agi, the fire god, which pervaded all directions, all reality. And a flame was the binding of Agi to one agitated locus. And this is how the Buddha spoke of how we take identity. We bind ourselves with upadana, craving, or clinging, and tanha, craving, this aspect of thirst and feeding, which we bind ourselves to the world with, agitated, localized, bound, consuming, turning to ash. And what's left if you don't do that is agi and a sense of pervasive light. And though the Buddha was so careful to not give too many concepts for what nibbana was, because it's beyond concept, one image he did give us was light that lands on nothing. Light that lands on nothing. Pervasive, luminous blessing. One of the amazing examples of the Buddha's skill and genius as a teacher was his second discourse, the fire sermon, the Adita Pariyaya Sutta. And in the Buddha's time in India, fire was considered something good. You cultivated tapas, a spiritual heat, such that you could cultivate spiritual power. And so the Buddha took this clan of fire worshippers who'd lived in this valley, and he inverted everything. He took them up to a hill in Gaya. He displaced them physically. And then with fire burning in the distance, he used it as a teaching and inverted everything from saying fire is something to be cultivated to saying the eye is on fire with what? Greed, hatred, and delusion. The ear, the tongue, and the cessation of that fire, the going out. This was the aim. And in one brilliant sweep, he changed the energy of fire bound to movement towards the energy of light and blessing, the enlightened mind. But one difficult thing is when we talk about nibbana, it's the Christians spoke about two ways of articulating truth. You have cataphatic method and apophatic. Cataphatic talks about God by what it is. Apophatic talks about God by what it's not. And the Buddha had watched all of his teachers, Uddaka Ramaputta, Alara Kalama, get stuck on these deep states of meditative absorption. And this is the issue with meditation, is sometimes the more refined states you come into contact with may be the most beautiful things you've ever touched. And it's almost impossible not to take them as God or some intuition of the ultimate. And the Buddha, seeing this, used a brutal and precise form of apophatic method. He gave us so little to falsely cling to with nibbana because it's beyond words, but rather he said, let go of everything you're not. Let go of the body, let go of this personality. And if you keep letting go of those things, you'll come to what you are. Or even that language is fraught. You'll come to what's left. And this is nibbana, and it's good. And some of you know the story of Michelangelo and someone asking him when they saw a sculpture he'd done of a horse out of marble, how did you change that block of stone into that horse? And he said, the horse was already there. I just chipped away everything that wasn't the horse. So this is what we do, is rather than accumulate on this path, we're letting go. And what's amazing about the triple gem that we take refuge in is that gems refract and hold light. And in the Buddha, in the Dhamma, in the Sangha, those noble beings who embody this truth and have purified their hearts, you see this light refracted and can find faith in that. You can intuit what this can mean in a human being, and that you too are capable of it. So the Buddha talked about 4 levels of awakening. And I think it's really important to revisit what we're walking this path for. What is awakening? Why are we practicing? What did the Buddha teach for? And to remember, this is the goal, is complete liberation of heart. The Buddha talked about stream entry, and he aligned each level of awakening with abandoning a series of fetters, shackles of the heart. So stream entry, he said, one abandons 3 fetters: self-view, doubt, and attachment to rites and rituals. The second level of awakening, Sakadagami, once returner, he said one softens the fetters of ill will and sensual desire. The third level awakening, Anagami, non-returner, one abandons ill will and sensuality completely. And the fourth and final level of awakening, arahantship, complete liberation of heart, one abandons the final 5 fetters of desire for rebirth in this form realm, the formless realm, restlessness, conceit, and avidya, ignorance, the master of it all. And this sounds sort of like some strange, esoteric, arbitrary leveling system, if anyone's played, video games. What's so useful to know, though, is this is the shedding of different levels of delusion. At stream entry, when one sheds the fetters of self-view, thinking that we are and are truly these 5 aggregates, the body, focal points of identity, the body, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. One no longer believes that they are these things. One sheds doubt because one has seen the true, intuited the true goal and touched it. And third is attachment to rites and rituals, customs and practices. And these 3 fetters are our social conditioning. It's everything that we're given since we're born: our name, our gender, our nationality. This is a self-view that's let go. The rites and rituals, those ways that have instantiated themselves into our consciousness as the route towards purification, we now see that those too are culturally conditioned. And this shedding happens from what they see happens in stream entry, which is one glimpses the deathless. And that this moment of contact with nibbana, the deathless element, is a split moment. The Buddha says there's 3 kinds of mind. There's a mind like a pus-filled boil that if one is spoken to with angry words, one blurts out angry words in return. And this is like a boil that when you press on it, spurts out pus. Then there's a mind like a lightning flash, which is the mind that's seen the Dhamma for one brief moment. And this is stream entry, but the defilements are too strong and they draw you back. And then there's a mind like a diamond, which is flawless, the completely enlightened mind of an arahant. In other places, stream entry is compared to looking down a well at water, but you don't have a bucket. It's that someone has seen this moment of the deathless. Their heart has contacted for one brief moment something beyond the conditioned realm, but they can't yet reach it. They know it's there. They can glimpse the glimmering water below. And this is a moment that the Buddha said was profoundly important. A change of lineage is what he called it. From tying ourselves to the conditioned realm to understanding that we've touched into something much, much deeper. And he spoke of it as it is a goal that one can reach. And I feel I've met many lay people, or some lay people, who have touched this goal. And the Buddha said that once one has contacted the deathless in one brief moment through stream entry, that one's course is irreversible towards awakening. You can never again fall to lower states. And I've heard this spoken of different ways, but one is that some people talk about at the end of death, there's a life review, and that when one has had a moment of stream entry, that at that life review, you see again, you touch again that memory, and it's so bright that you can't fall. I don't know if that's true or not, but the idea is that after this, your course is set towards Nibbana, and only 7 more lifetimes in the human of rebirth can be expected before awakening. There's a sutta where the Buddha picks up a bit of dust on his fingernail and says, "Bhikkhus, what is more, this dirt on my fingernail or that of the great earth?" And they say, "Lord, the dirt on your fingernail is little. The dirt in the earth is much more." And he says, "Even so, the suffering left for a stream enter is like the dirt on my fingernail. The suffering you've endured is like the great earth. If you had to compare all the tears you have cried in your countless rebirths past, they would be greater than the ocean," the Buddha said. And stream entry, this moment of shift, and it's interesting, it sounds so foreign and distant, but you hear people talk about these moments. And one alternate etymology, the commentaries love to play with words. In Sotapanna, stream enter, they sometimes change sota from stream to ear enterer, because so often how people either remember their the stream entry or achieve it seems to be hearing the Dhamma. In the suttas, it's common that someone hears the Dhamma from the Blessed One, and the insight arises, whatever is subject to arising is subject to passing away. That's the essential insight. That's the core. And I remember talking to a relative in Idaho and saying, as the mind gets calm, you can begin to see truth more. And, with a certain degree of skepticism, this person said, "Oh, and what's truth?" And in Buddhism, truth, the essential truth is things are impermanent. That's it. What is subject to arising is subject to passing away. I mean, there's more in that statement, but that's the essential core. And if one really sees that, then the world, then the heart, the noble ones say, stops creating more proliferation, more rebirth, and something deeper is touched. There's one teacher talks about Meichi he knew who, I think he said he believed she was a past life stream enterer. And whether or not one believes in past rebirths, these are powerful and beautiful recollections. And this woman had been the fashion consultant for the Queen of Thailand. And she loved going to operas in Europe and loved fine things. And she went to a Dhamma talk by a forest monk named Longpo Phun. And he gave this talk, and it was her first time deeply intuiting the Dhamma. And then he went around, as Ajahns in Thailand are wont to do, with a sprinkling of holy water. And he asked if she wanted some holy water. And she said, "No, I don't want any." And he said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Nibbana." And he said, "Okay, come back tomorrow." And she came back the next day, and she was wearing white. And she determined, and she remembered exactly what she was wearing that day when she got sprinkled with holy water. It was a Gucci scarf. And she went to one more opera. She loved the operas. And she went to one more opera, flew to Europe to go see it. And everyone on stage she just saw as a skeleton. And she said, "Well, I guess I'm done with this now." And she went back and went to stay with Longpo Ban in his monastery. She stayed in a little hut. And the queen came and visited her and walked over, down the forest path to her hut, and was astounded to see her fashion designer, who had formerly had wardrobes of clothes, just with a simple hut with a picture of Longta Mahabua on the wall or something like that. And she was the initial contact between the royal family in Thailand and the Kruba Ajahns, these teachers. I think one beautiful thing to remember is that when the Buddha spoke about stream entry, he said a person with 5 things is incapable of stream entry: stinginess as regards to one's family of supporters, stinginess with regards to one's monastery, lodging, stinginess with regards to one's possessions, reputation, and miserliness. Generosity is implicit and necessary for the path. And the next stage the Buddha talked about was a once returner who is, so they say, destined to return just once before attaining awakening. And for them, ill will and sensual desire is softened. And then the third level is an anagami, non-return. And they say will never return to the sensual or the human realm. And they've given up the fetter of sensual desire and aversion completely. And this is the shedding of the level of conditioning of biology, the body. All living things move towards food and flee from pain. And so it takes longer to shed that layer. I don't know if it necessarily always takes longer, but there's 2 levels of kind of softening those fetters because they are such large ones to shed. And the Buddha said that beings who attain that state are reborn in a very refined rebirth where they are destined to practice for the complete ending of suffering, which is attained on the 4th level of arahantship, where one abandons desire for the fetters of desire for the form realm, the formless realm, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. And these are the conditioning of the mind itself, the most refined level that is shed. There's a beautiful sutta where, and one can wonder, what's the difference between that first fetter shed at stream entry, Sakkaya Ditthi, self-view, positing a self with the khandhas, the aggregates of identity, and conceit, which is abandoned at the final level. And there's this beautiful sutta called about Khemika, Venerable Khemika, who was on his deathbed. And some elders sent a monk messenger to go ask Venerable Khemika, do you consider any of these aggregates of your personality, you and yours? And he said, no, I don't identify with any of these. He'd attained at least stream entry, so he no longer imputed himself on these focal points of identity. Because, so they say, once you've encountered that deathless element, you no longer can believe you are just this body, just this personality, just this name. Something deeper has been touched and intuited. And they said, well, are you awakened? And he said, no, I'm not awakened. And then they sent the messenger back and forth and said, how are you not awakened if you don't impute self into any of these aggregates of identity? And Venerable Khemika went to them, despite being sick, and said, it's like a flower that a lotus, red, white, or blue, one can still touch or smell the scent of the flower, but does not know whether that scent comes from the stamen or the petals or the stem. Even so, I do not identify with this body, this feeling, this cognition, these mental formations, this consciousness, but the sense of self still lingers. And at that moment, all those monks became enlightened, including Venerable Khemika, and he is known as the one monk in the suttas to get enlightened from his own Dharma talk. So this sense that repeatedly seeing with wisdom is what takes one to the final goal of awakening. And what that state is beyond words, beyond articulation. The people press the Buddha so often for details about that state. There's a famous sutta called the Vacchagotta Sutta, where Vacchagotta says, after death, does a Tathagata, do you exist, not exist, both exist and not exist, neither exist nor not exist, which is the classic Buddhist quadrilemma, as it's called, just covering all your bases and then some. And the Buddha said, does not apply, Vacchagotta. Just as this candle flame, if it went out, Vacchagotta, would you say the flame went to the north, south, east, or west? And Vacchagotta says, does none of those apply? It's simply reckoned as out. And the Buddha said, even so, Vacchagotta, that form by which one could reckon the Tathagata, that feeling, that cognition, that mental formation, that consciousness, that the Tathagata, the Buddha, has done away with, cut off like a palmyra stump, deprived of the conditions for further becoming. The Tathagata is deep, immeasurable, profound like the ocean. And you'll see what the Buddha did there in this brilliant moment of teaching is in one phrase, he speaks about nibbana as the extinction of this heat and clinging. And in the next breath, he makes sure that we know it's not nothing. It is deep, immeasurable, profound like the ocean, fire and water in one teaching. And people asked the Buddha all the time to speak more about this, but what he said was practice for the sake of that which is complete cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion. And what it is beyond words. And the power of this path is seeing that state instantiated in human beings. And there are still beings, I believe, alive today. I believe I've met some who are awakened. And I remember being so hungry to see that in someone, see anything beyond the ordinary throughout high school and college, and then finally going to Thailand, meeting these monastics who all they did was give. And when you stepped into their presence, there's this resounding emptiness. It echoes into you. There's a quality that is, it's almost like a rip in reality. And to know that it's not nothing and the pursuit of it is not selfish, that the Buddha said this is a state that requires no justification from society. And that when one cultivates that path, the goodness is profound. It ripples out. People have so much suffering and difficulty in their life, and the world contorts itself into so many ways trying to fix this and that. But when you see someone practicing and having practice for the sake of cleansing the heart, and you see it and you meet that person, there's an uplift in the heart, a leaping up. And these are the most true moments of falling in love I've ever had, is seeing someone who embodied this and just knowing this is what I've been waiting for this whole time. And we can ask, why is this relevant to us? You know, maybe my meditation's not that good. I don't know if I'll ever attain stream entry, let alone arahantship. But it's relevant because it orients us. And if we remember that and intuit this nobility in the heart which the human being is capable of, everything can become in service of that goal and movement towards it. A whole life. And there's a Zen story called, it's actually true, at least by all accounts, a peasant woman named Chiono, and she was a disciple of a 13th century Zen monk named Baku. And she went to a senior nun in the monastery and said, I am not educated, I can't read. Is there any hope for me to practice the Dhamma? And the nun turned to her and said, wonderful. In Buddhism, there are no distinctions between individuals. There's only this. People must remain devoted towards their desire for awakening and the compassionate heart. When you turn towards the source of all your deluded thoughts, there is no other. There is only the nature. This is Zazen. And so Chiono went about her daily business thinking, all I have to do is live my daily life with my practice as a constant companion. And one day, a few months later, she was carrying a bucket of water under the moonlight. And the bamboo bottom of the bucket, it was held together with bamboo strips, dropped out. And that was her awakening moment. And she uttered the verses, For so long, I've tried this and that to keep the bucket together. But when the water has nowhere to gather, the moon has nowhere to land. So we speak in Buddhism about letting go of the conditioned realm. And that doesn't mean we can't pick it up, but we pick it up lightly and playfully, and we don't depend on it for lasting security and happiness. But what all that is in service of is seeing that what we're letting go of is just this bamboo bucket and this reflection of the moon. And that because we've been hypnotized by that, we're looking in the exact opposite direction of the real moon, which is right above us. And it's a beautiful path, that motion of the eyes up towards the night sky, where there's a luminosity and a brightness which has always been waiting for us, and which we've felt on our skin for so long, and to finally come into contact with teachings that let us remember how to orient ourselves towards that is a great gift. So even as things are difficult, as different elements of our lives are fraught and full of suffering, just remembering this is your chance to see the flimsiness of the bucket and to remember the higher order goal that we have stepped onto or towards as practitioners. And I wish you all the best in that pursuit. So.
Andamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Dharamase. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu anumodami.
So this talk is not making any claims about my own practice at all, but I think it's important to revisit these concepts because it orients us. So people can feel free to use the restroom, or if you need to stretch your legs, but we do have time for questions. So if people want to raise their hand, we can run a mic over to you, and if you're on Zoom, you can also raise your hand.
Thank you for the teachings you've already provided. It is rare to find someone who is so mixed with both intellectual commentary and wisdom, and I really appreciate that. My question relates to the practice, which was new to me today. Is there a particular type of giving that is more effective to reminisce on? In my experience trying to practice, the more I had a relationship with that person that I was giving, the more that I had a storyline along with the giving, the less effective the practice felt for me. Whereas it was the random givings to people I didn't know that was more, just came out of me because of the view of suffering, felt like more uplifting.
What's your name, by the way?
My name is Danny.
Danny, that's such a helpful piece of wisdom. I think you're right. The first act of real giving is kind of our first act of freedom, of something kind of completely done out of this deeper place in our heart often. And I think the more that's distanced from storylines, you're right, the more pure that act can be in some ways. So the metric really is what brings that uplift into the heart, and when you recollect it. Ajahn Nisabho talks about this as this great untapped treasure we have. How there are these moments in our life, he talks about giving this talk in Portland and recommending this practice, and the man driving him back from the Dhamma talk was in tears, remembering. He said, actually, what came to mind when you were giving that meditation was when years ago, I was driving down the road and I looked over and I saw this kid on the side of the road, and there was this shattered milk jug at his feet. And I pulled over and asked him what was wrong, and he was in tears, just saying his mother had sent him to get this milk jug, and it had shattered, and now he would have to go back empty-handed. And he said, so I took him back to the store and got him a new thing of milk. And that simple act was so pure and spontaneous that it still brought him to tears. And I think there's something to that. The fact that even a small act from that long ago, even divorced from a storyline, maybe particularly because it's divorced from a storyline, is pure enough to invoke something very profound in the heart. And it's interesting, the pericope, the phrase that the Buddha uses to talk about enlightenment, letting go, chaga, analio, without attachment, is really, really similar to the phrase he uses about generosity. One dwells at home, open-handed, rejoicing and giving alms, responsive to requests. Chaga, this word like giving up, giving, is in both. So it's interesting, like it's a very simple act. It can be from these simple things, but it has a very profound resonance in the heart. And so yeah, I think the metric really is what brings to mind or brings to heart that brightness. But I think you make a good point about divorcing it from a storyline can be especially potent.
Thank you for that answer, and it definitely inspires me to be more unconditionally and randomly kind.
Yeah, sadhu, sadhu. And I think there's good research that negative experience is about kind of soaked, it's absorbed into the how do I put it, the brain almost 6 times more quickly than a positive experience. We really have to focus on, once burned, twice shy. So we really have to focus on giving attention to the brightness that we have cultivated in the good things for them to really make an impact like they should. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think someone on Zoom? Angela? Go for it. Angela, I think you're maybe mute. Just a second, Angela. Go for it.
There we go. Thank you, Ajahn. So what do we do with a certain delusion that some things in life are worth suffering for or attaching to? Like this little floofy guy, for example, and other living beings and social causes and things like that.
I think that it's very important to remember the distinction of terms between tanha, craving, which is unwholesome desire, and chanda, which is wholesome zeal or enthusiasm. And that one, tanha, is to be abandoned, and chanda, zeal, is to be cultivated in line with Dhamma appropriately. And when people ask that question, like you just did, and I think probably many people have this kind of question after this talk, like, are you saying just pull back from all the mess of the world? And it's really not that. It's just recognizing as you practice the flavor of tanha, how there's an burning quality to it. It's filled with dukkha. It's focused on results and the end result of something. It's fixated and it's suffering. Even, in very small, specific instances like craving after a donut, it's a really unpleasant experience to be stuck in craving and to tie our hearts to various causes that we know will pass. And you get an intuition for what chanda feels like, and that aspect of enthusiasm and zeal. And part of that is the sense of uplift in the heart, of rejoicing in the act of doing something, regardless of the end result, of rejoicing in a relationship, but there's not the sense of entanglement and feeding off of the other. If you're participating in a cause, the sense of real brightening in the heart that it comes with it. And just noticing like which relationships and causes are you able to have that relationship with, and focusing on those for the sake of one's practice. So yeah, I'd say that often the intuition that there's certain relationships or causes that we need to be attached to is because of a slight warp of our vision where we intuit there's something really important about a relationship or a cause. But what we don't realize is we can still honor that intuition of truth and significance, but from a place of wholesome dharmic energy rather than craving and feeding off of something. And if there's certain things you just can't have that relationship with, then seeing if you can get some distance or some centeredness or focus your attention elsewhere, because it's not wholesome for anyone if you are interacting with a heart of craving and heat. Does that help, Angela? Also, those animals you're with are just cute, so that's a high bar. So, yeah.
Thank you,
But
Ajahn. That is helpful.
yeah, and just the sense of duty. It's like we know the people we love are going to leave us and die and pass, and relationships are going to change. So can we do our duty to those beings and care for them in this brief moment we have, but as a gift rather than an expectation? Something like that. Steve.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Could you tease apart avidya means fundamental ignorance, or means ignorance, and it also is sometimes framed, and we talked about it a tiny bit, not knowing the Four Noble Truths, but from a Mahayana point of view, it means essentially not seeing emptiness. And if emptiness is, and the Buddha talks about emptiness, it doesn't feel quite the same as it does in Mahayana. I'm always trying to sort of weave it all together. And if emptiness is, ultimately not clinging and seeing the nature of reality and its radiance and radiant and empty, how does all that weave together? Especially the Four Noble Truths sounds like a list, whereas this is not list.
Not list. We do love our lists in Theravada. The Buddha loved lists. So avidya, ignorance, I probably should have addressed that. That's kind of the root thing, isn't it? The Buddha talked about it as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths at its most basic, as an applied skill. As an applied skill. So the Four Noble Truths each have a task. So one comprehends dukkha, lets go of its source, craving, realizes peace, cessation of dukkha, and cultivates the path to that cessation. And the idea is samsara is something we do. We're constantly in dependent origination. Ignorance leads to sankhara, which is the moving out of the heart into impulse and buying into the world again, looking for satiation in what can never give satiation. Because our vision is warped, we think, we intuit this hole in the heart, this hunger for true lasting happiness, and the only way we know to go is to go out looking for that and feeding off of things around us. But that hole in the heart can never be satiated by external conditions ever. And it's like drinking salt water. It just gets more and more thirsty. And the Four Noble Truths is seeing clearly the full, just the picture. Like, part of why we buy into, falling in love and falling head over heels is because we don't really understand that this will end. And it's not like people can't get into a relationship that's dharmic and wholesome, but it's that extra flush of delusion of tying your heart to things. And if you really see the Four Noble Truths again and again, you really see like, this is what the world can offer and no more, then you stop tying your heart to that. You stop doing samsara. And so the noble ones say, this is when the heart just touches something very different. It stops creating the world. And it sounds like a list, but the Four Noble Truths are just one motion of heart. I mean, really, at their core, it can be just that much. Like, oh, this is suffering. I don't want to grab onto something. It's like, for me, rafting trips. My family used to go on rafting trips, and they're really fun to think about and plan. But then you actually put together a rafting trip, and you have to rent a raft. You have to get the thing. You have to drive to the place. You have to put in the water. Then everyone's kind of like fighting. You get stuck on rocks. There's like, after a while, you're like, I don't actually want to go on a rafting trip anymore. And there's some good rafting trips out there. But but I think that's the motion of the Four Noble Truths. And it's just so simple. And it's like there's a New Yorker cartoon where there's all these cows eating grass. And then there's a picture of one cow looking up and he's like, this is grass. We've been eating grass. And so yeah, and as to how Mahayana emptiness features, I think that's one way of intuiting the first noble truth of suffering. Incompleteness, dukkha, is seeing, oh, actually, it's empty. This is all inconstant, fading, constantly changing. It's not worthy of tying my heart to. So for me, I mean, if you really see just that, there's a sutta called the Kaccayana Gota Sutta where the Buddha says, one sees just this, sufferings arising and suffering ceasings. This is one's right view, independent of others. So there comes a point, it seems, in practice where that is enough, just letting go again and again and again. And emptiness, I think, allows that. So different ways of articulating stuff, but I think the Buddha's is the most stable. Of all the people who taught Buddhism, we Theravadins just think the Buddha did it best. So other skillful means do exist, though. We do have to wrap up. I'm sorry. We never have quite enough time for questions. Yeah, okay, we do. Let's read the chanting. If you didn't get a chance to ask the question that you wanted to ask, on Wednesday evenings, we do have time on those Zoom sessions, so please come for that. So maybe we can read the chanting requests. And these are just people whose names